In the peaceful streets of Lawrence, Kansas, a sudden and tragic event shatters the calm. A 51-year-old man, Gary Bell Edens, becomes the victim of a deadly altercation right at his doorstep. A gunshot echoes through the neighborhood, marking a fatal moment where one life is lost and a web of secrets and lies revealed. This case, classified as murderer, unveils a startling story of confrontation leading to the untimely death of one. Occurring on July 17, 2013, the arrest in this case was made the very same day. The victim, born in 1993, met his end through a shooting, an act that rocked the core of the Lawrence community in Douglas County, Kansas, USA. What led to this senseless act, and who is to blame? Dive into a story where every turn uncovers deeper mysteries, with the truth as elusive as it is shocking. The perpetrator, in a turn of events, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 155 months, or nearly 13 years, in prison on February 27, 2014. Join us as we piece together the puzzle of this murder that left an indelible mark on a community and its history. The calm before the storm. In the tranquil neighborhood of Lawrence, Kansas, Gary Bell Edens, a 51-year-old man, epitomized the quiet life of the town. His days were marked by a steady rhythm, mornings in his modest office job, evenings tending to his garden, his hands patiently nurturing the plants, a metaphor for his approach to life. Gary's existence, though uneventful, was rich in contentment, punctuated by laughter-filled weekend barbecues with neighbors and quiet nights reading by the fireplace. Not far away, in the bustling streets of Topeka, lived Brittny Marie Adams, a stark contrast to Gary. At 20, Brittny's life was a tumultuous journey, her young eyes already weary with burdens. Her world was one of constant motion, shifting from one part-time job to another, her nights often spent wandering the neon-lit streets or in the company of fleeting acquaintances. Brittny's struggles were not just with the world but within, as she grappled with a past that seemed to constantly shadow her present. The two lives, so divergent, were destined to intersect under the most tragic circumstances. It began on an ordinary day when Brittny discovered her car, a battered sedan that was more a lifeline than a vehicle, missing. Panic set in quickly. The car was essential, not just for her mobility, but as a symbol of the independence she fiercely clung to. Her mind raced through the events of the past week, and a suspicion took root. Her car might be with someone at Gary's residence. A murky connection from a night gone wrong, a fleeting encounter with a stranger linked to Gary, became the focus of her blame. Desperate for resolution, Brittny turned to Jonathan Rush, a 29-year-old acquaintance from Wichita. Jonathan, with his rugged exterior and history of minor run-ins with the law, was an unlikely companion. Yet in him, Brittny found a willing ally, someone who didn't ask too many questions, someone who understood the language of the streets. Together, they take off on a journey to Lawrence, a decision driven more by desperation than reason. The drive to Gary's house was a mix of ominous silence and tense conversation. Brittny, her hands clenched on her knees, oscillated between anger and fear, while Jonathan kept his eyes fixed on the road, aware but not entirely invested in the unfolding drama. As they neared Gary's residence, the sinking sun cast long shadows on the streets of Lawrence, a visual metaphor for the darkening turn their journey was taking. Arriving in the neighborhood, a stark contrast to the world Brittny and Jonathan were accustomed to, they were greeted by quaint houses and well-kept lawns, a picture of suburban peace. Gary's house, a modest single-story with a well-tended garden, stood unassumingly in the 600 block of Michigan Street. The duo parked a little way off, the car's engine ticking as it cooled, a foreboding soundtrack to their mission. As they walked towards Gary's home, each step seemed to amplify the tension. Brittny's thoughts were a whirlwind of what-ifs, her heart racing with a mix of fear and a desperate need for resolution. Jonathan's presence, a silent shadow beside her, was both a comfort and a reminder of the gravity of their action. The final moments of this act find Brittny and Jonathan at Gary's doorstep, the quiet of the neighborhood enveloping them like a cloak. Brittny's hand hovered over the doorbell, a simple action that was about to unravel the lives of everyone involved. The act ends just as her finger presses down, the doorbell's chime sounding ominously in the twilight, a prelude to the chaos that was about to unfold. The altercation. As Brittny and Jonathan arrived at Gary's home, the evening's calm was about to be shattered. Brittny, filled with a mix of fear and determination, knocked on the door. Inside, Gary, who was enjoying a quiet evening with his son Jeremy, a young man in his late 20s, was taken aback by the unexpected visitors. Jeremy, curious about the late-night disturbance, joined his father at the door. When Gary opened the door, Brittny confronted him, her voice trembling but fierce, demanding to know about her car. Gary, confused and taken aback by the accusation, denied knowing anything about it. The conversation quickly escalated, with Brittny becoming more agitated and Jonathan stepping in, his presence adding to the tension. Jeremy, trying to protect his father, stepped forward, resulting in a physical altercation between him, Jonathan, and Brittny. In the scuffle, shouts and angry words were exchanged, and the situation spiraled out of control. Neighbors began to take notice, peering out of their windows at the commotion. In the midst of the chaos, a gunshot suddenly rang out, cutting through the night and silencing the shouts. Gary, struck by the bullet, collapsed onto his doorstep, his body going limp as he fell to the ground. Jeremy, stunned and horrified, knelt beside his father, his hands trembling as he desperately tried to understand what had just happened. Brittny and Jonathan, realizing the gravity of what had occurred, were overcome with panic. In a frenzied state, they fled the scene, leaving behind a neighborhood plunged into shock and disbelief. The sound of the gunshot echoed in their ears as they made their escape, the weight of their actions beginning to sink in. The aftermath of the shooting was immediate and profound. Neighbors who had witnessed parts of the altercation hurried to call the police and emergency services. The quiet street, usually so peaceful, was now a crime scene, bathed in the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. As news of the shooting spread, the community reeled in shock. Gary, known as a friendly and kind neighbor, was a familiar face to many. The senseless violence of his death left friends and acquaintances struggling to make sense of the tragedy. People gathered in small groups on the street, their conversations a mix of grief, fear, and disbelief. Jeremy, now sitting beside his father's lifeless body, was consumed by a mix of grief and shock. The arrival of the police and paramedics brought little comfort as the reality of his father's death sunk in. Questions swirled around the neighborhood. Who were the assailants? Why did this happen? The once tranquil street was now a place of sorrow and unanswered questions. As the night wore on, the police began their investigation, cordoning off the area and speaking to witnesses. The community, once so quiet and uneventful, was now the center of a tragic story that would leave an indelible mark on the lives of all those involved. Fallout. After the tragic shooting at Gary's doorstep, the once quiet neighborhood of Lawrence was enveloped in a flurry of police activity. The investigation into the shocking event began immediately. The police, with their notepads and cameras, swarmed the scene, collecting evidence and speaking to shaken witnesses. Neighbors, still in disbelief, recounted what they saw and heard, the argument, the scuffle, and the chilling sound of the gunshot. As the pieces of the puzzle started coming together, the focus turned towards Brittny and Jonathan. Witnesses described a young woman and a man arguing heatedly with Gary and Jeremy before the fatal shot was fired. Some even recalled seeing them fleeing the scene in a state of panic, which only heightened the suspicions against them. Meanwhile, Brittny and Jonathan, now on the run, were gripped by fear and regret. Their attempt to escape their actions proved futile. Within hours of the incident, the police, using descriptions provided by witnesses and local surveillance footage, tracked them down. Brittny was arrested the same day, her world turning upside down as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Brittny Marie Adams, 20, is now charged with premeditated first-degree murder in connection with the July 17th death of Gary Edens. Jonathan, too, was apprehended, and both were taken into custody, facing the grim reality of their situation. As they sat in separate interrogation rooms, the weight of their actions began to sink in. Brittny, overwhelmed by the gravity of what had transpired, found herself crumbling under the pressure. Confronted with the evidence, witness testimonies, the ballistic report from the crime scene, and her own inconsistent statements, she began to unravel. The police, methodical and persistent in their questioning, pieced together the narrative of that fateful night. The legal proceedings commenced swiftly. The The court case was a mosaic of complex emotions and legal intricacies. Brittny, facing a myriad of charges, appeared small and defeated in the courtroom, a stark contrast to her defiant demeanor on the night of the incident. The evidence against her mounted. Eyewitness accounts painted a vivid picture of the altercation, and forensic evidence linked her to the crime. As the trial progressed, the community watched with bated breath. Gary's family, especially Jeremy, attended every hearing, their faces etched with grief and the quest for justice. The prosecution presented a compelling case, bolstered by the physical evidence and the powerful testimonies of the witnesses. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against her, Brittny's defense struggled to counter the prosecution's narrative. The turning point came when Brittny, realizing the futility of denying her involvement, decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder. This plea was a seismic shift in the trial, as it meant accepting responsibility for Gary's death, albeit without the premeditation characteristic of first-degree murder. Brittny's guilty plea brought a somber resolution to the trial. The courtroom, filled with the Edens family, neighbors, and media, listened intently as the judge acknowledged her plea. The sentence would come later, but the plea itself was a pivotal moment, marking the end of one chapter of this tragic story and the beginning of another. In the aftermath of the plea, the community of Lawrence tried to find its footing again. The case, which had captivated and horrified the town, left a lasting impact. It raised questions about impulsiveness, accountability, and the fragile nature of life. For Gary's family, the guilty plea was a small solace in their profound loss, a loss that would forever mark the history of their small Kansas town. The sentencing. The final act of this tragic story unfolded in the solemn atmosphere of a courtroom where the consequences of one night's actions were to be firmly decided. The room was filled with a tense silence as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence to Brittny Marie Adams, the young woman whose life had taken a turn she never expected. Before the sentencing, the court heard emotional testimonies from Gary's family. The most heart-wrenching of these came from Jeremy, Gary's son. His voice quivered as he spoke of the father he had lost, a man who was not just a parent but a friend, a guide, a source of unwavering support. Jeremy described the gaping hole his father's death had left in their lives, the pain that seemed to deepen with each passing day, and the injustice of a life taken too soon. As he spoke, the courtroom was enveloped in the raw emotion of his words, leaving many with teary eyes and heavy hearts. Other family members and friends shared their memories of Gary, painting a picture of a man deeply loved and sorely missed. They spoke of his kindness, his laughter, and the small, everyday joys he brought to their lives. Their testimonies not only highlighted the immense loss they felt, but also the ripple effect of such a violent act on a community. Then came the moment of sentencing. Brittny, who had remained mostly silent throughout the trial, stood up, her posture betraying the weight of her guilt and regret. The judge, in a stern yet somber tone, addressed her directly, speaking of the gravity of her actions and the irreversible harm she had caused. Topeka woman sentenced to 13 years for July 2013 murder of 51-year-old Lawrence Mann. He sentenced Brittny to nearly 13 years in prison, a duration that seemed both long and yet incomparable to the lifetime of loss Gary's family would endure. The sentence brought a complex mix of emotions to the courtroom. For some, it was a semblance of justice, a necessary closure to a chapter marked by tragedy. For others, especially Brittny's family and friends, it was a stark reminder of the consequences of a momentary lapse in judgment, of how quickly lives can be altered irreversibly. As the court adjourned, reflections on the nature of justice permeated the air. The case had become a poignant example of how violence leaves a lasting impact, not just on the victims and their families, but on the wider community. It sparked discussions on the justice system, its role in balancing punishment with rehabilitation, and its attempt to heal wounds that might never fully close. The story of that fateful night in Lawrence, Kansas, and its aftermath lingered in the minds of those involved and those who followed the case. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the repercussions of impulsive decisions, and the intricate web of consequences that follow a single action. As the years passed, the community slowly healed, but the memories remained, a somber reminder of the night when the calm of a small town was shattered by a gunshot. This story, woven with loss, regret, and the quest for justice, would forever be etched in the history of Lawrence, a poignant testament to the irrevocable change brought about by a single act of violence. In this gripping story, we delve into the lives of two central figures, Brittny Marie Adams, a young woman from Topeka, and Gary Bell Edens, a 51-year-old man whose life takes an unexpected turn. The narrative explores themes of impulsivity, the far-reaching consequences of violence, and the pursuit of justice in a world turned upside down by a tragic event. Brittny, fueled by a rush of emotions and driven by circumstances, finds herself embroiled in a situation that spirals out of control. Her actions, taken in a moment of impulsiveness, lead to a catastrophic outcome, the death of Gary. This act not only shatters Gary's family, but also alters Brittny's life irreversibly. Gary, an individual with his own complexities, becomes an unwitting victim of a violent act. His life and untimely death leave a void in the hearts of his loved ones, who struggle to come to terms with the senselessness of their loss. The story thoughtfully presents these characters as more than just their final acts. It delves into their backgrounds, their hopes and fears, painting a picture of human complexity. It's a narrative that encourages the audience to reflect on the thin line between right and wrong and the profound impact our decisions can have on others' lives. As the legal proceedings unfold, the script touches upon the nuanced and often challenging pursuit of justice. It raises questions about responsibility, remorse, and redemption, leaving the audience to ponder the true meaning of justice in the face of overwhelming grief and loss.